because in other aspects I probably wouldn't. But it does help.
For decades, Princess Anne had built her reputation on discipline, duty, and an almost complete refusal to let personal feelings dictate her decisions. But reportedly, moments ago at Windsor Castle, she carried out what sources describe as one of the most consequential acts of her royal life. Before a visibly unsettled gathering, Anne approached Catherine with Queen Mary's historic laurel circlet and placed it upon the Princess of Wales, symbolically passing to her a responsibility that had once belonged almost entirely to the Princess Royal. And while the ceremony itself was extraordinary, according to people close to the situation, it was Camilla's reaction that revealed just how deeply the decision had unsettled the family. Before we examine why Anne made this choice, and what reportedly happened behind closed doors, make sure you subscribe to Royal Unbeatable so you do not miss the next major development. The atmosphere in St. George's Hall reportedly changed the moment Anne appeared, carrying the ceremonial circlet herself. The Grand Chamber, traditionally associated with significant royal occasions, had apparently been prepared for a gathering whose true purpose remained concealed from most of those present. Sources describe Anne as having refused the assistance of an equerry, choosing instead to carry the historic object personally. To those watching, that detail reportedly made the moment feel less like a celebration and more like a final act of personal responsibility. Catherine noticed the strain immediately. William, standing nearby, reportedly understood from his aunt's expression that something far more serious was unfolding than the family meeting Catherine had expected. Anne then stopped in front of Catherine and instructed her to kneel. According to people close to the situation, Catherine hesitated and briefly looked towards William, before quietly admitting that she had anticipated a discussion, not anything resembling a coronation. William reportedly gave her a restrained nod, although those nearby say his expression suggested he had known more than he had allowed his wife to believe. The distinction was important. This was not a constitutional transfer of the crown, nor did it give Catherine formal governing authority. Instead, sources describe it as a symbolic passing of responsibility. The expectation that she would help steady younger members of the family, bring relatives together during difficult periods, support charitable commitments, and increasingly serve as one of the monarchy's emotional anchors. The reported decision had already been authorized by Charles 2 days earlier through a sealed declaration, described as a formal written instruction confirming the new responsibility. The king reportedly remained seated during the ceremony, appearing exhausted by the weight of what was taking place. But attention repeatedly returned to Camilla. Sources describe the queen consort as sitting with her hands tightly clasped, watching Anne and Catherine without interrupting. According to insiders, she had not been given an opportunity to shape the ceremony beforehand, and that lack of involvement reportedly left her deeply unsettled. Her silence, rather than an open confrontation, became one of the most closely observed details of the entire occasion. Anne had reportedly insisted on secrecy because she wanted Catherine's response to remain genuine. Only Charles, William, and 2 trusted officials were said to have known in advance that the circlet would actually be placed upon the Princess of Wales. When Anne finally lowered it onto Catherine's head, she placed both hands gently upon her shoulders. Sources describe her as delivering a private message about keeping the family united when others could no longer do so. Catherine reportedly struggled to maintain her composure and reached for Anne's wrist. Applause followed, but according to those familiar with the atmosphere inside the room, the reaction was far from universally comfortable. And this is where Camilla's position becomes crucial, because the symbolism of Catherine's elevation reportedly went far beyond a simple family honor. For years, Anne had effectively performed the role Catherine was now being asked to assume. She had reportedly settled disagreements behind palace doors, confronted relatives when necessary, and maintained the demanding standards associated with the late Queen Elizabeth II. Her influence came less from formal authority than from the respect she had accumulated through decades of service. Yet sources say Anne had begun to recognize that her own ability to remain at the center of family affairs was changing. Watching Catherine accept the circlet, therefore, represented more than a ceremonial handover. It reportedly signaled the beginning of another generation taking responsibility for keeping the family together. William's reaction was equally significant. Before entering the hall, he had reportedly struggled to conceal his concern. According to people close to the situation, he repeatedly adjusted his clothing while standing with Catherine in a private room, apparently searching for a way to discuss the responsibility without making her more anxious. He knew his wife had already faced years of intense public scrutiny, but he also reportedly understood why Anne believed Catherine had earned the confidence of younger royals. When Catherine asked whether he genuinely believed she could manage the burden, William reportedly answered immediately. He then took her hand, in what insiders interpreted as an acknowledgement that supporting her would also mean accepting the personal cost that came with the role. Charles, meanwhile, reportedly experienced the decision differently. By signing the declaration, he had given formal backing to Anne's choice, but sources describe the moment as an uncomfortable recognition that authority alone could not determine who the family trusted most. The king could establish duties and responsibilities, but he could not manufacture personal loyalty. Camilla, according to people close to the situation, understood that distinction perhaps more clearly than anyone else in the room. Her position as queen consort gave her enormous visibility, but Catherine's new role reportedly placed the Princess of Wales closer to the emotional center of family relationships. That distinction is believed to have been particularly difficult for Camilla. According to insiders, she had expected to retain significant influence over family occasions, private relationships, and the younger generation. Catherine's elevation potentially altered that balance. Instead of Camilla being the principal figure involved in maintaining family cohesion, Anne had reportedly selected another woman to carry that responsibility forward. The issue, therefore, was not simply who received a ceremonial circlet. It was reportedly about who the family would instinctively turn to when tensions rose. But what nobody expected was what reportedly happened between Anne and Camilla before the ceremony even began. Sources describe a private encounter in a narrow corridor at Windsor Castle, shortly before the gathering. According to people familiar with the situation, Camilla confronted Anne and questioned whether the decision meant the royal family believed she was incapable of keeping everyone together. The exchange was reportedly tense but controlled. Anne did not attack the queen consort, nor did she openly challenge her status. Instead, insiders say she gave a short response. The decision was about trust rather than rank. For Camilla, reportedly, that answer carried a painful implication. She could possess the title, the position, and the proximity to the king, yet still not be the person Anne believed the family would naturally follow during a crisis. Sources describe Camilla as visibly affected after the conversation, reportedly pausing alone before continuing towards the ceremony. Anne, meanwhile, understood that the decision she had made in the name of family stability could create another wound before it created any sense of unity. Stay with this, because this detail reportedly changes the entire meaning of the ceremony. The story of Catherine's elevation did not begin inside St. George's Hall, nor did it reportedly originate with a palace committee or an elaborate succession strategy. According to insiders, Anne's thinking began several months earlier at Sandringham, during a private service marking the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's accession. What happened after that service reportedly lasted less than 15 minutes, yet it changed Anne's assessment of who could be trusted when royal protocol began to break down. 5 months earlier, Charles had gathered members of the family at Sandringham for a private chapel service followed by lunch. Camilla, William, Catherine, Anne, Edward, Sophie, and several younger relatives were reportedly present. Even before the gathering began, however, sources describe an unusual level of tension. The king was expected to discuss future responsibilities and the distribution of duties during periods when senior royals might reduce their public workload. Because the occasion marked the anniversary of Elizabeth II beginning her reign, comparisons with the late queen's ability to maintain stability were reportedly impossible to avoid. Anne entered the meeting expecting Charles to discuss Camilla's expanding responsibilities. According to people close to the situation, a draft schedule had been prepared outlining which senior royal would take responsibility for family gatherings, public representation, and other duties during periods of reduced activity. At that stage, there was reportedly no indication that Catherine would become the focus of Anne's thinking. Yet what unfolded at Sandringham would eventually cause the Princess Royal to reconsider who could actually hold the family together, when ceremony and protocol were no longer enough. Charles rose shortly after lunch, carrying the prepared folder he had been expected to review. He began addressing the family, but within moments his words faltered. His eyes fixed on the page as though he could no longer follow what was written there. The folder slipped from his hands. Camilla immediately called for assistance, while William moved towards his father, and Edward received instructions from across the room. What had been an orderly gathering suddenly became confused and tense. Yet according to people close to the situation, it was Camilla's reaction in those first seconds that would later become one of the most closely discussed details of the entire episode. Catherine did not wait for someone else to take control. She calmly moved the younger members of the family away from the room, asked Sophie to stay with Camilla, and instructed William to remain beside Charles. Edward was sent to locate the physician discreetly, rather than allowing uniformed staff to flood the room and turn a private family emergency into a visible palace incident. Sources describe Catherine as remarkably composed throughout the moment. She did not issue dramatic commands or raise her voice. Instead, she gave each person one simple responsibility, and the confusion began to settle. Anne watched as Catherine lowered herself beside Charles without hesitation. The king took her hand and reportedly asked whether the children had seen what had happened. Catherine reassured him that they were safe, settled, and had not understood the seriousness of the situation. That response reportedly reassured Charles, but it also made a powerful impression on Anne. Camilla, meanwhile, had witnessed the same events from a very different position. According to insiders, the Queen was deeply unsettled by how quickly Catherine had become the person everyone instinctively looked towards. Once Charles had recovered sufficiently, Camilla reportedly waited until the immediate danger had passed before approaching Catherine privately in the library. She challenged Catherine for assuming control without being instructed to do so, reminding her that compassion did not automatically change the established hierarchy. Catherine reportedly answered that she had not been considering rank in that moment. Her concern had simply been the safety of the family. Anne was standing near the adjoining doorway and heard the exchange. She reportedly said nothing, but the confrontation reinforced something she had already begun to notice. Camilla wanted authority to be recognized formally. Catherine appeared to gain it simply because people trusted her when pressure arrived. Anne later discovered the folder Charles had dropped beneath a chair. According to sources familiar with the account, she returned it to his desk and examined the papers inside. A draft proposal would have given Camilla greater influence over family affairs. Beside it were Catherine's handwritten instructions from the emergency. One document represented formal authority. The other showed what had happened when nobody had time to discuss titles or precedents. And that contrast reportedly became central to Anne's thinking. But what nobody expected was how strongly Camilla would react once she discovered what Anne had decided. From that point, Anne reportedly became convinced that Catherine had not deliberately taken command. The family had turned towards her naturally. She quietly discussed the possibility with William and began considering how such a transfer could be presented without humiliating anyone. Camilla, however, eventually learned what was being discussed and demanded a private meeting with Anne. According to people close to the situation, what followed went far beyond a disagreement about royal ceremony. It became an intensely personal confrontation over trust, loyalty, and Camilla's place within the family. 3 weeks before the planned ceremony, Anne reportedly arrived at a private sitting room at Clarence House and asked for the door to be closed. Camilla was already there, waiting beside the fireplace. On the table was a draft declaration bearing Anne's proposed recommendation. No advisors remained in the room, and neither woman had anyone present to soften the conversation. For years, their relationship had been restrained by royal convention, but sources describe this meeting as the point when the underlying tension finally came into the open. Camilla had reportedly learned through her private secretary that Anne intended to recommend Catherine as the family's principal figure for internal coordination. The council involved was described as a private mechanism for handling disagreements, maintaining family unity, and dealing with sensitive matters away from public ceremonies. Camilla reportedly expected there would be room for negotiation. Anne, however, arrived having already reached her conclusion. She respected Camilla's commitment to Charles and understood the sacrifices she had made for the king. But according to insiders, Anne did not believe devotion to Charles automatically gave Camilla the ability to command the confidence of every member of the family. Camilla reportedly pushed the document across the table and drew attention to the section naming Catherine as the family's first point of unity during periods of crisis. She wanted that wording removed. Anne read the passage carefully and, rather than crossing it out, reportedly marked it more firmly. The gesture said more than an argument could have done. Camilla's response was reportedly emotional. She questioned whether she would always be regarded as someone the family accepted because of Charles, but never genuinely trusted. Sources described the moment as unusually revealing because beneath Camilla's anger was a deeper fear, that even after years beside the king, her position inside the family would remain permanently conditional. Anne reportedly told her that the decision was not intended as punishment. She did not question Camilla's feelings for Charles. The issue, she explained, was whether people felt comfortable enough to speak honestly when Camilla was present. According to insiders, Anne believed several relatives had become increasingly cautious and guarded whenever discussions involving the Queen's office took place. Camilla reportedly interpreted those remarks as a judgment on her entire history within the monarchy, rather than an assessment of her leadership style. Anne then referred back to the earlier crisis at Sandringham. Sources say she argued that when Charles became unwell, Camilla had been focused on the seriousness of the situation and the potential consequences, while Catherine's immediate attention had gone towards the frightened members of the family. Camilla reportedly struck the arm of her chair and accused Anne of allowing one frightening incident to define years of service. Her response made clear just how personally she regarded the decision. But stay with this, because this detail changes everything. Camilla reportedly warned Anne that placing Catherine in such a prominent position could effectively produce two competing centers of influence, one surrounding Charles and Camilla, and another surrounding William and Catherine. Anne's answer was blunt. According to people close to the situation, she believed those divisions already existed, and that refusing to acknowledge Catherine's unifying role would only deepen them. As Anne prepared to leave, Camilla reportedly stopped her with one final question. Had Charles himself truly chosen Catherine? Anne turned back and said the king had chosen what he believed would protect his family, although sources say she acknowledged that accepting the decision had been deeply painful for him. That left the final decision with Charles. The king had approved countless official papers during his reign, but this particular document reportedly carried a different kind of weight. It did not strip him of authority. Instead, it forced him to acknowledge that there were limits to what his own position could achieve inside his family. Catherine had reportedly demonstrated an ability to bring relatives together during moments when Charles struggled to do so. For the king, the choice therefore became deeply personal. Protect his pride, or accept a structure that might preserve the family beyond his own reign. Charles reportedly reviewed the two-page declaration alone in his private study at Buckingham Palace. The proposed arrangement would allow Catherine to coordinate senior family gatherings, support younger working royals, bring greater unity to charitable activities, and assist William when private disputes threatened to escalate. Anne's long service gave her enormous influence, but she could only recommend the change. Charles still had to approve it. William's consent mattered, and Catherine herself retained the right to refuse the role. When Charles reached the section describing the symbolic ceremony in which Anne would transfer her authority to Catherine, he reportedly stopped reading. Sources describe him removing his glasses and placing them beside a photograph of Queen Elizabeth. For several minutes, he remained silent. According to insiders, he was thinking about how frequently his mother had relied upon Anne when disagreements threatened to divide the family. Charles reportedly said quietly that his mother would have understood the decision. But that thought also carried an uncomfortable implication. Accepting Anne's judgment meant accepting that his own approach had not always created the unity he wanted. Camilla entered before Charles had fully composed himself. According to people familiar with the situation, he immediately covered the declaration with his hand. But the Queen noticed the gesture. She reportedly asked whether the decision had already been settled. Charles answered that some decisions were effectively determined by circumstances before anyone formally put a signature to them. Camilla then asked the question that sources describe as the most painful moment of their conversation. Was Charles choosing Catherine over his own queen? The king reportedly rejected that interpretation. He told Camilla that the decision was not about selecting one woman against another. It was about recognizing the person the family already turned towards when circumstances became difficult. He reportedly reminded Camilla that during the earlier crisis, Catherine had protected his dignity, reassured the younger members of the family, and asked for nothing in return. For Camilla, hearing that distinction may have been even harder than a direct rejection. She was being told that her title could not manufacture the trust Catherine had earned through behavior. Charles reportedly agreed to one final protection before approving the declaration. A confidential clause would require Catherine to seek reconciliation before excluding any member of the family from significant discussions. Her new influence could not become a means of retaliation, and Anne's decision had to be presented as an attempt to preserve unity rather than punish Camilla. Charles eventually signed the document and passed it towards Anne. Anne reportedly placed her hand over her brother's and assured him that Catherine would strengthen the family, without attempting to diminish his position. Neither of them celebrated. According to sources close to the situation, they understood exactly what the decision could cost. Anne had secured the king's approval for the transfer, but Camilla's reaction remained unresolved. And once the sealed notices reportedly began reaching members of the family, resistance emerged behind closed doors. The ceremony that was supposed to demonstrate unity was suddenly facing the very division it had been created to prevent. The invitations arrived without the usual royal insignia and offered almost nothing beyond a request for selected family members to appear at Windsor Castle. Yet, reportedly, those who opened them quickly realized that the gathering carried far greater significance than a routine family engagement. According to people close to the situation, Princess Anne had decided to step away from her position as the family's senior guardian and place that responsibility in Catherine's hands. And while the decision was presented as an act of continuity, sources describe Camilla's reaction as far more complicated. One invitation was reportedly destroyed almost immediately. Another was quietly put away, while William was said to have urged Catherine not to confront the inevitable criticism without support. Edward reportedly agreed to attend, with Sophie following his lead, because insiders have said they understood why Anne had selected Catherine. Some of the younger royals were described as relieved by the development, while senior courtiers were already considering what it could mean for influence, access, and precedence. In royal terms, precedence determines who takes prominence during official occasions, and even an internal adjustment could affect the balance of authority. Catherine would reportedly oversee family discussions whenever Anne was unavailable, help organize responses to private family emergencies, and rely on written authority from Charles when a wider family meeting needed to be called. But what nobody expected was the reaction reportedly unfolding at Clarence's house. Sources describe Camilla receiving the notice and reading it without immediately speaking. She is said to have folded the document carefully and placed it inside a drawer rather than passing it to an aide. According to people close to the situation, she then waited until she was completely alone. The Queen reportedly removed a bracelet Charles had given her and sat quietly with it in her hands. Insiders have said that, whatever her private feelings may have been, she understood the distinction between receiving a ceremonial title and possessing the confidence of the family itself. And that distinction, according to those familiar with the matter, was precisely what made Catherine's new position so difficult for Camilla to ignore. The situation became even more tense when Andrew reportedly responded with outright opposition. Sources describe him tearing up his invitation and making clear through his private office that he would not attend a ceremony which, in his view, gave Catherine moral authority over relatives who had been in the family far longer than she had. Anne reportedly received the refusal through a formal message and interpreted it as a challenge to the final request she had intended to make. She had expected objections, insiders have said. What she had not anticipated was Andrew turning her farewell appearance into a confrontation over Catherine's legitimacy. Catherine, meanwhile, reportedly received the news at Kensington Palace with concern rather than anger. According to people close to the situation, she told William that she would rather abandon the responsibility than allow Anne's final public duty to become an embarrassing spectacle. William is said to have moved closer, sat directly opposite her, and insisted that withdrawing would not necessarily calm the situation. His argument, sources describe, was that giving in would demonstrate that family pressure could still dictate every major decision. Stay with this, because the next detail reportedly changed the entire confrontation. Anne had already prepared for Andrew's resistance. A handwritten message sent to him reportedly made clear that attending the ceremony was not being treated as an endorsement of Catherine. Instead, according to insiders, Anne framed his presence as a final gesture of respect for the late Queen's belief that duty should continue, even when family relationships were strained. Catherine then reportedly decided to contact Andrew herself. She did not issue an instruction, appeal to Charles's authority, or attempt to pressure him through William. According to people familiar with the conversation, Catherine simply told him that Anne deserved to see the family together for what was intended to be her final major public appearance. Andrew reportedly remained quiet for several moments before agreeing to come. He was said to have made one condition clear: he would not kneel, applaud, or publicly act as though he supported Catherine's new role. Sources say Catherine accepted those terms without argument. That decision became significant because, according to insiders, Catherine had achieved something Anne had hoped to see before stepping aside. She had managed to bring a hostile relative into the room without publicly humiliating him. No title had been used against him, no royal authority had been invoked, and no confrontation had been created. Yet Camilla's position remained unresolved. Sources described the Queen as watching the developments carefully, aware that Catherine was gaining influence through persuasion rather than formal rank. And for Camilla, according to people close to the situation, that may have been the more unsettling part. The evening before the Windsor ceremony reportedly brought a far more personal exchange. Anne dismissed her remaining aides and asked Catherine to stay behind. Catherine had arrived expecting another discussion about protocol, but sources say Anne instead closed the briefing papers and prepared tea herself. There were reportedly no officials present, no husbands, no king, and no audience. For a brief period, the Princess Royal was simply an older woman preparing to hand an exhausting responsibility to someone she believed could carry it. The circlet reportedly remained inside a dark case on the table between them. Anne had deliberately sent the equerries away, leaving Catherine alone with her. An equerry is a royal attendant responsible for assisting senior members of the family during formal duties. But according to insiders, Anne wanted none of that formality that night. She wanted Catherine to understand the weight attached to the object before she ever saw it placed upon her head. Years of service, private interventions, and repeated family crises had reportedly taken their toll on Anne. She would still offer guidance when asked, but sources described the Windsor appearance as the final scheduled public duty in this particular chapter of her service. Catherine reportedly admitted that she did not feel entirely prepared. She understood that critics could accuse her of attempting to displace Camilla, challenge Charles's position, or create a separate center of influence around William. According to people close to Catherine, however, her greatest fear was not political. She reportedly worried that years of absorbing the family's pressures without complaint could eventually leave her unable to protect her own children from the consequences. Anne is said to have reached across the table and taken her hand. Her message, according to insiders, was that courage did not mean being untouched by fear. It meant continuing to stand beside people, even when doing so became personally difficult. Catherine reportedly lowered her gaze, allowing the silence between them to remain. Then Anne explained why she had chosen her. Sources describe the decision as being rooted less in rank than in years of observation. Anne had reportedly watched Catherine remain present during some of the family's most difficult periods, even when withdrawing might have been easier. She had seen Catherine support Charles without exposing his vulnerabilities, stand beside William without encouraging his anger, and speak to Anne herself as a person, rather than treating her as an institution that could never break. According to people close to the situation, those details mattered more to Anne than titles ever could. She reportedly believed Catherine had earned the family's confidence without demanding it. Only then did Anne open the case containing the ceremonial circlet. Beneath its velvet lining was reportedly a handwritten message attributed to Queen Elizabeth II. According to the story surrounding the transfer, the late monarch had left Anne with a principle for deciding who should eventually carry the family's trust. Responsibility should go to the person capable of inspiring affection without insisting upon it. And that, insiders have said, was the moment Catherine understood that the ceremony was not simply about receiving Anne's authority. It was about accepting the burden behind it, while Camilla, watching from the other side of the royal divide, was left to consider what Catherine's growing influence could ultimately mean for her own place within the family. Catherine reached toward the document, but for a moment she stopped short of taking it. Anne then reportedly revealed that this decision had not been made overnight. According to people close to the situation, the Princess Royal had spent years quietly observing members of the family, considering not their titles or seniority, but how they behaved when those around them were frightened, uncertain, or under pressure. Rank, age, and position had apparently never been the deciding factors. What mattered was whether people felt safe enough to speak honestly. Charles trusted Catherine. William relied on her judgment. The younger members of the family reportedly turned to her when they needed reassurance. Even relatives who had reservations about her growing influence were said to listen when she spoke. Catherine reportedly made only one request before accepting the responsibility: that Anne would remain close whenever the pressure became difficult to bear. The Princess Royal assured her that taking on responsibility did not mean carrying it without support. Catherine then accepted, not as some grand personal victory, but as a commitment to protect the family Anne had spent decades serving. Anne embraced her warmly, without the formality normally associated with such a moment. But while Catherine was accepting Anne's trust, another question was beginning to dominate the private atmosphere around Windsor. How would Camilla respond? When the castle doors eventually opened and the first pictures reached the public, what had happened inside Windsor was no longer a private family matter. Reports suggested that broadcasters across Britain interrupted scheduled programming as news of Anne's decision spread. Editors reportedly began preparing fresh front pages, while crowds gathered outside Windsor Castle, trying to understand exactly what they were witnessing. Was this simply Anne stepping away from a public responsibility, or had something far more significant taken place? Then Anne appeared beside Catherine. She took Catherine's hand and raised it towards the waiting crowd. Any uncertainty disappeared almost instantly beneath the reaction from those gathered outside. Buckingham Palace reportedly issued the signed declaration shortly afterwards, confirming that Anne had completed her final public duty and that Catherine would take responsibility for the family's private council and its work surrounding unity, personal disputes, and sensitive family matters, away from public ceremony. Charles's office reportedly described the development as continuity, while William's team framed it as another example of service. Anne's staff, meanwhile, urged the public not to focus on speculation surrounding her decision to step back. Stay with this, because the reaction inside the family was far more complicated than the cheering crowds outside suggested. Hundreds reportedly remained near Windsor as Anne and Catherine appeared together. One woman near the front held up a handwritten message, thanking Anne and expressing confidence in Catherine. According to people familiar with the scene, Anne noticed it and briefly lowered her head. Catherine tightened her grip on Anne's hand. To observers, the gesture appeared to capture the significance of the moment. Anne's era of direct leadership was ending, while Catherine's new responsibility was beginning. Yet for Camilla, watching the same images, the symbolism reportedly carried a very different meaning. The following edition of the Daily Chronicle reportedly devoted its entire front page to the event, describing it as a transfer of duty and affection. The main photograph showed Anne placing the ceremonial circlet on Catherine, while William appeared visibly emotional and Charles stood behind them with a serious expression. The circlet itself carried no constitutional authority. It was a small ceremonial crown associated with honor rather than sovereignty. But according to commentators, its emotional significance was considerably greater than its formal status. Eleanor Hart reportedly described the scene during an evening broadcast as evidence that influence within a royal family can sometimes be built through confidence and personal trust rather than inherited position alone. Supporters viewed Catherine as a natural figure for the next generation. Critics, however, argued that the palace was effectively creating an unofficial future queen within the family, while diminishing Camilla's position. And that criticism reportedly struck directly at the queen consort's private concerns. Sources describe Camilla as watching the Windsor footage alone. When Anne lifted Catherine's hand before the crowd, Camilla reportedly switched off the television. For several minutes, the room was silent. Then, according to people close to the situation, she turned the broadcast back on and watched the ceremony from the beginning. The second viewing reportedly affected her differently. What she had initially interpreted as rejection began to look more like affection between two members of the same family. That distinction would become important later. Charles, meanwhile, reportedly read the first wave of headlines and asked an aide whether the public understood that Anne had chosen to step back rather than being forced aside. When he was told that crowds were calling Anne's name, the king was said to show visible relief. Camilla's response was more restrained. According to insiders, she later sent Catherine a handwritten message indicating that she would not attempt to stand in her way. Catherine reportedly kept the note beside Anne's circlet rather than releasing its contents publicly. The ceremony itself had ended, but the private consequences were only beginning. That evening, with photographers gone and the crowds dispersed, the family reportedly gathered at Windsor for one final private meeting. There were no cameras, prepared speeches, or public ceremony. The circlet had been removed from Catherine's head and placed safely inside its case. Anne had relinquished the public responsibility she had carried for years. Catherine had accepted the burden, while Charles was reportedly beginning to recognize that his influence over the family's internal dynamics had limits. But the real test, according to people close to the situation, was not what had been written in the declaration. It was how the family members would treat each other once nobody was watching. Catherine reportedly entered the room without the circlet and deliberately ignored the chair positioned beside Charles. Instead, she chose an ordinary seat. The decision appeared designed to make one point clear. Whatever authority Anne had entrusted to her, Catherine did not intend to turn it into personal superiority. Precedence, the formal system determining who sits, speaks, or appears first at royal engagements, would not define this new chapter. Then Anne reportedly moved toward the opposite end of the table. Catherine immediately pulled out the chair beside her and asked Anne to sit there. According to insiders, Anne understood the message without needing an explanation. Catherine was not pushing her predecessor away. She was asking her to remain part of the future. Charles reportedly stood before dinner concluded and addressed Anne directly in front of the family. The king acknowledged that her judgment had protected the institution at moments when pride, anxiety, and uncertainty had caused others to hesitate. He then turned towards Catherine and made a distinction that reportedly carried considerable weight. Anne's declaration had given Catherine responsibility, but the trust she had built over the years had already given her legitimacy within the family. According to people close to the situation, Charles was beginning to understand that authority could maintain an institution, but trust was what kept a family together. William then reportedly took Catherine's hand and assured her that her new responsibilities would never become an excuse for the institution to consume her private life. The prince had apparently worried that Catherine might become overwhelmed by the demands placed upon her. She reportedly responded that her first priority would remain protecting their children and ensuring that the next generation could serve, without being trapped by the culture of silence that had burdened previous generations. But what happened between Camilla and Catherine after dinner may have been the most revealing exchange of the entire evening. According to insiders, Camilla approached Catherine and acknowledged that her initial reaction had been driven by fear. The queen consort reportedly admitted that she had worried the ceremony represented her exclusion from the family's future. She asked whether there was still a meaningful place for her, alongside Charles, and within the changing family structure. Catherine reportedly reassured her that Anne's decision was not an attempt to create a rival queenship. Instead, she asked Camilla to continue supporting and advising the king as the family adjusted to the new arrangement. Camilla reportedly extended her hand. Catherine did something less formal. She embraced her. The gesture could not instantly resolve every disagreement or erase every private insecurity, but according to people close to the situation, it changed the atmosphere between them. Catherine was not asking Camilla to surrender her place. Camilla was not being publicly humiliated, so Catherine could rise. Instead, the two women appeared to be acknowledging that the family's future could not depend upon one of them losing for the other to gain. Anne then reportedly removed the small insignia she had worn during years of private family councils and placed it beside Catherine's hand. Her message, according to insiders, was that the family did not need another commander. It needed someone capable of reminding them why remaining united mattered in the first place. Anne's decision was therefore described by those close to her not as surrender, but as the final expression of the same duty that had defined her public life. Catherine had not become sovereign. She had not replaced Camilla, and she had not taken constitutional authority from Charles. What she had reportedly received was something less formal, but potentially more influential: the family's recognized center of trust. After the others had left, Catherine reportedly closed the case containing the circlet and handed it to the royal custodian. She kept only the handwritten note associated with Queen Elizabeth. The ceremonial object belonged to the past. The promise represented the future. And perhaps that is why Camilla's reaction matters so much. What initially looked to her like a personal loss reportedly became, by the end of the evening, something different. Anne had not chosen Catherine to defeat Camilla. She had chosen her because she believed Catherine could carry forward a responsibility built on trust. For Camilla, accepting that reality may have been the hardest part of the entire transition. Princess Anne's public role did not end with the family losing one of its strongest guardians. Instead, according to those close to the situation, it ended with Anne demonstrating that she believed Catherine was ready to lead the family through its next chapter. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Royal Unbeatable, and we'll see you in the next one.